So what we have in front of us, as the title implies, we're going to be talking about teshuvah.
Okay.
Teshuvah, of course, because it's Elul. I'm sorry, I may have...
Does anyone need?
Not enough. So, we're talking about teshuvah, and the title is Complete Transformation. We're going to look at the primary text from the Gemara, from the Talmud, which states that through teshuvah one can transform the past sins into merit. And we're going to look at 6 different ways of understanding that, how one can transform their past and what that means. But before we get there, just a brief word on teshuvah itself. Teshuvah is actually it's treated in a lot of texts like a mitzvah like all others. In other words, you have 613 commandments, and one of the 613 commandments is, if there's sin, there should be teshuvah. So just like every commandment has its parameters for what one has to do to fulfill their obligation, as it were, there's also the halachic parameters of what teshuvah is. The first one to really elucidate that, articulate that in a very specific, detailed manner, of course, is the Rambam. And built on that, and to some degree it's kind of built on that, is the Alter Rebbe in the first 4 chapters of his essay on teshuvah. The essay on teshuvah is 12 chapters. The first 4 deals with the halachic parameters of what teshuvah is, and then the latter, from 5 through 12, discuss the Kabbalah of teshuvah. So just to give you the kernel of the halachic teshuvah, so the way the Rambam puts it, and this is not just the Rambam and others as well, it's charata ala avar, which means regret of the past, and kabbalah ala haba, and resolution for the future. That's the essence of the halachic teshuvah. A person regrets the action and resolves to not do it again or to start doing it going forward. That's the basic halachic definition. The Alter Rebbe goes a step deeper and says that in halachic sense, in that the essence of that two-way movement, regret from the past and resolving to continue in the future, for the future, is the decision. It's a one-minute decision that a person makes to no longer sin. And he explains that even on the halachic level, the definition of sin is the transgression of the king. In other words, there are 2 elements to every sin. One element to a sin is, or same thing is true of a mitzvah. One element is what that mitzvah accomplishes and what you're hoping to avoid with the sin. So if you're going to think of it in terms of, we talk about building a home for Hashem. So if you're going to think of the commandments in terms of building a home, you have the commandment which says, put the bricks here, otherwise known as positive commandments, and then another commandment which says, don't break the glass, negative commandment. So there is what the actual commandment does. It lays a brick in a particular location, and it helps you avoid shattering any glass. There's a deeper element to every mitzvah and sin, in that they are essentially something God asked to do and something God asked not to do, regardless of what they happen to accomplish, or if they accomplish nothing at all. The point is, you're asked to do it, you're asked not to, and the teshuvah, as the Alter Rebbe puts it, is on that. Meaning, if a person failed to do a mitzvah or transgressed, then besides for not having accomplished what they should have accomplished, or aside for having broken the glass, metaphorically speaking, they failed to fulfill a commandment of the king. And therefore the teshuvah is, at the essence level, says the Alter Rebbe, the essence halachic level, is the decision to no longer transgress or no longer violate the king's command, whatever it so happens to be. So that's the essence of teshuvah. Now, the deeper levels of teshuvah are all about what motivates me to get to that decision. But the essential decision remains the same. It's the decision to no longer transgress the king's command, coming out in these 2 ways, regret in the past and taking resolution for the future. But the essence of it is a decision to no longer to no longer violate the king's command. And then the levels of teshuvah that we talk about are the motivation, the intention, the intensity of that decision, but that's all within the person coming to the conclusion of making that decision. So for the purposes of our Gemara, the primary text we're going to say here is that in the context of not the actual decision to note that the actual teshuvah to no longer sin, but the intention and the motivation that brought the person to that decision. So this Gemara, this Talmud, you see it there in the English as well.
Can I just have a question?
Yeah.
You're putting these like in kind of an absolutes. When somebody transgresses
Yeah.
a particular mitzvah,
Yeah.
so they're not going to consider themselves as tzaddikim and never to do it again, but their goal is a much smaller and narrow, but to say this particular avodah I'm going to take on myself.
That's a very good question.
Not do this particular one, but it's not to become perfect. It's to we can't take 50 steps at a time. We got to take 1 step at a time.
Okay, that's a very good question, and I'm glad you picked up on that. I wasn't going to go down that route, but just very briefly, the way the Rambam puts it, he puts it the way you do. That every mitzvah sin has a tshuva for itself. So say, whatever, a person did X, they make a decision to no longer do X. The Alter Rebbe frames it, actually, that's all sin. Which is why I gave that whole introduction, how the sin is really not just you failed to put the brick, but you failed the king's command. And therefore, if you're going to return from that, then it has to be, I'm no longer going to fail the king, period. Right? That's what the Alter Rebbe puts it. That it's not just tshuva for one particular sin or mitzvah, but actually for everything. Which is pretty heavy. Now, in understanding what that means and how it's possible for a person to live up to that ideal, so I haven't seen this written anywhere, but I have some indication that it might be true. And this is, again, my personal reading into what the Alter Rebbe writes. So you can either agree or disagree. That's fine. And I see it in two ways, one of two ways. Either, and this is indicated in the last chapter of that essay on Teshuvah, chapter 12, either a person every morning can wake up and say, I'm no longer violating the king's command, period. Finished. I'm no longer sinning. And then 2 hours later, something happens and the person didn't live up to their decision. So the question is, when the person made that decision in the morning, were they lying? No, they meant it. It just so happens to be that later on the day, there was another part of me that got in my head and said, do something else. But it doesn't take away from the truth of that moment. And in that sense, a person can be doing teshuvah every hour, every day. And the Alter Rebbe alludes to this, and he talks about how 3 times a day in our prayer, we ask Hashem for teshuvah and we ask Hashem for forgiveness. Meaning, at morning service, we're asking for forgiveness from sins we did since last night. And then in the afternoon, we're asking forgiveness for sins we did since the morning. And then in the evening, since the afternoon. Which means almost like the prayer is set up that it's expecting you to be doing teshuvah 3 times a day.
So then why do we have to say prayers 3 times a day?
For that reason.
Just that once?
For that reason. Because we're constantly trying to make this decision again and again. That's one way of looking at it. And again, that's my indication from that last chapter where the Alter Rebbe talks about that. The other indication, I think, this might be more common in terms of people's experience, is that a person maybe once and maybe twice in their entire life actually makes really a decision, I'm no longer going to sin. Maybe once in their entire life. And then the rest of their life, a person's fighting to actually live up to the decision they once made. That I think is a more common experience that people have. There's a time when a person really makes this, okay, I'm changing the way I live. And then there's a question of living up to it and to what degree and how quickly and how fast and how slowly or whatnot.
Work in progress.
Yeah. So I think that's some way of understanding that. Answer the question, I think? Okay. So now to the text. So this Gemara comes from, you can see on the top, it's Yuma, Pei Vav, Ayin Beis stands for Amud Beis. That's Tractate Yuma, page 86b. Tractate Yuma. Yuma means the day in Aramaic, and it's the tractate dealing with the laws of Yom Kippur. Most of the chapter discusses the laws surrounding the service in the temple on Yom Kippur, and then the last chapter gets into Teshuvah. And here, so if you look at the last word, if you're looking at the Hebrew, if you're looking at the English, it's the second word, Reish Lakish. If you're looking at the Hebrew, it's the last word on the top line. Amar Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish stated. Reish Lakish is just very brief history. It's interesting to note because he's one of the famous Baal Teshuvahs of the Gemara. He was an individual who this is the story the Gemara describes. He was a bandit. He ran some group of thieves, and he was standing on a river, and he looked across and he saw what he thought was a beautiful woman. He was so excited, jumped across the river, and lo and behold, he sees the sage Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was well known for his good looks and never grew a beard. So from the other side of the river, he thought it was a woman. And then when he sees Rabbi Yochanan tells him, listen, sorry? Yeah, that's right. He says, I have a beautiful sister, and if you come with me to study Torah, I'll introduce you to her. And he does, and he marries her, and Rabbi Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lakish, Reish Lakish is an abbreviation for Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, and Rabbi Yochanan, brother-in-laws / study partners, who have very extensively quoted throughout the Talmud as like disputants / like compadres, if you will. And there's a long history to their story. But this is Reish Lakish, famous Baal Teshuvah. So Omer Reish Lakish said, Gedola Teshuvah, great is Teshuvah, Shizdonis, that through Teshuvah, Shizdonis, one's sins that one does intentionally, knowingly. Nasis Lakish Gagas, they become considered as if they were done unintentionally. So whatever consequence comes along with a sin done intentionally, through Teshuvah they get downgraded, and now they're only treated as if you did it by mistake. And he quotes a verse, as the verse reads, Shuva Yisrael, return unto God, Ad Hashem lekach to God your Lord, Ki kashalta b'aveinecha, for you have stumbled in your iniquity. Aveinecha. Now, so the Gemara asks, Ha'avain mezid, this term that we use to describe sin in this verse, you stumbled on your iniquity, on your sin, this term for sin is avain, and avain, iniquity, means an intentional sin. The kakari la michshal, and the verse said you stumbled on it. So how do you stumble into an intentional sin? So explains Reish Lakish, well, you stumbled into an intentional sin because your intentional sin became being treated as if it was done by mistake. So it's like you stumbled into an intentional sin. So this is one statement from Reish Lakish. Are we clear? Without getting into the verse. Right. So how do we uphold both? So Reish Lakish explains, the sin was done intentionally, but because now you did teshuvah, it's been considered as if you stumbled. So because of teshuvah, it's been downgraded from an intentional sin to an unintentional sin. Okay, so one statement. So says the Gemara, Eini, is it so that when a person does teshuvah, their sins are downgraded from intentional to, or upgraded, depending which you're looking at it, to unintentional sins? V'ha'omer Reish Lakish, but Reish Lakish, the same person, said elsewhere as follows: Gedolah teshuvah, great is repentance. Shezdoinus, that their sins nasis loy, become considered kizachis, like merit. So not only are sins demoted from intentional to unintentional, they actually get transformed into merit. So the balance sheet, it goes from negative to a plus. It goes from a liability to an asset.
I'm just curious. I remember learning that an intentional sin you can do. There's true for it, but an unintentional, I don't remember how it goes. But in terms of what you can do, like the punishment, when it came to punishing somebody who did a grievous sin, if it was intentionally, so there was something they could do to rectify it, but an unintentional one, it didn't have anymore.
I'd have to see the text. I'm not sure. Okay, so the Gemara quotes a verse to cite this second statement from Reish Lakish, which says that sins, even intentional ones, get transformed into merits. Shneimar, as the verse reads, Uveshoiv rasha mirashasai, and when the wicked returns from his wickedness, this is the verse, V'asam mishpat utstaka, and he does justice and righteousness and charity, Aleihim, on them, in the plural, Yichya, he lives. On them, implying that it's not just one thing that he lives on, merit, but actually lives on both of them, on the sin and the merit. Implying that the sin itself becomes a merit and becomes a form of life. Okay, so two statements. One statement that the sin goes from intentional to accidental, and one statement that it goes from intentional to merit. So how do we reconcile these two statements? Says the Gemara, like Kasha, this is not a question. And this gets to what I began with before, in that teshuvah remains the same, the decision to no longer sin. But the question is, what's the motivation? And here the Gemara says there are two types of motivation. Kan me'ahava, kan me'yira. One statement is referring to when a person does teshuvah out of love. That's his motivation. Loves Hashem, wants to get closer to Hashem. And then if a person does it that way, and that's the motivation for the decision to say, I no longer want to sin, then his sins become a merit, because he did it out of love. But if he did it out of fear, his fear of retribution, then his teshuvah is not 100%, because the person may still want to sin, but he's just afraid of retribution. So we consider those sins as if they're accidental and not fully merits. Is that clear? So teshuvah out of love takes the sin from a sin to a merit. Teshuvah out of fear takes the sin from intentional to unintentional. That's the Gemara statement. Clear on that? Okay. Now we're going to get into how is it possible that a person, how is it possible for sin to become merit? How is it possible? You can say it's wiped clean, right? We won't, I don't know, we take it off your balance sheet, we're not going to punish you for it. But merit seems to imply there's going to be a reward for it. You're going to get rewarded for the sin because you did teshuvah. Why? How? And furthermore, as many of the commentaries ask, so the guy who never sinned loses out. There's a whole bunch of merit that the sinner comes with his baggage, and the tzaddik doesn't have.
Yeah, but they say about tshuva rises to a higher level than a tzaddik.
That's the question. This is the question we're asking. You're right, that statement is true. It does say that about teshuvah raises to a higher level, which connects to this statement, as we shall see in the commentaries. But the question becomes as well, why? It's not fair to the tzaddik.
You go deeper, you learn from your mistakes, and it...
So let's see how that works. Yeah?
Sorry, but can't the sinner doesn't have to feel like I'll never be able to get to a good
Yeah.
level. It doesn't mean it's more of a level.
Yeah, so there are two different statements here, but we'll look at them separately. They're connected, but let's just separate them for a second. The first statement, which is here, which says that the sin becomes a merit. So it's not just about the level of the Baal Teshuvah, it's actually talking about the sin. In other words, the sin itself gets taken from the balance sheet, from liability to an asset. That in and of itself requires explanation. Yeah, you want to wipe it off wipe it clean, fine, get it. But why is it becoming a merit? As for the other statement about the Baal Teshuvah becoming greater than the tzaddik, the precise wording of the statement is Ein Yecholen Lamed Sham, which means the tzaddik can't, not that he doesn't stand in the same place as the Baal Teshuvah, he cannot, incapable. That's a statement, that the tzaddik is incapable of standing at the level of Baal Teshuvah. Ein Yecholen Lamed Sham. It's a pretty heavy statement, but that's not the statement here in our Gemara. Here we're trying to understand how a sin goes from a liability to an asset. How does it become merit, as opposed to just taken off the balance sheet? Okay, how's everybody's Hebrew? Should we go straight to English or read the Hebrew? Straight to the English? Okay, the first statement we have, I promise you the texts are all here. The first statement we have is from the Maharsha. Maharsha is a classic commentator on the Talmud. Specifically, he's widely known, at least he has two parts to his commentary. One of them is, it's on the bottom of page 1. And one of them is, he's well known for his Agadic commentary,
Which one are you reading?
the bottom one on the first page, the Hebrew. I don't have English translation, that's why I asked. Sorry. Not for these, but. So he explains as follows. He basically says that one who does teshuvah out of love, so one who does teshuvah out of fear, meaning a person's fear of retribution, then a person will only avoid sin or do what God wants so long as they aren't going to get blamed for it. Right? Do my work and let me go home. I'm just afraid of consequence. I'm going to do it just as much as I need to. Right? So, in that sense, when a person does an intentional sin and then out of fear decides to do teshuvah, then what happened in their mind vis-a-vis that sin? The past sin. What happens is, I might still do it again, but I'm afraid of doing it again. That's what the teshuvah out of fear is. Now, if that's the case, then the sin that I did then is no longer intentionally there. It's like I slipped past my fears, in a sense. But if a person does teshuvah out of love, then here's where Marsha gets into this. When a person does teshuvah out of love, so now what they want to is to connect more to Hashem. So because they sinned, what the person will end up doing is try to do much more to compensate. Right? If a person loves somebody else and betrayed them, and you want to fix it, not because you're afraid the person can do anything to you, you're constantly trying to do new things to prove you really mean it.
It's guilt also.
maybe a bit of guilt there too, which motivates the person to do much more. So says the Maharsha, this is a simple reading of what this means, that the Baal Teshuva gets more merit. Gets more merit because the person now is, out of love for Hashem, wants to prove his loyalty, prove his connection, and ends up doing more mitzvahs, and therefore has more merit. Which means, in theory, if a tzaddik decided to go out of his way to do, a person who never sinned decides to go out of his way to do more mitzvahs, you also get the merit. It's not like there's a, at least as far as this statement goes, it doesn't say that the tzaddik can't get that merit. It's just the nature of life is that the one who sinned and wants to connect out of love will end up doing much more. That's the way the Maharsha puts it in a simple level. Yes?
So what about on the opposite side, the person who was that, somebody betrayed somebody?
I'm using that as
He wants to do tshuva and he won't do it again.
yeah. I'm using that as a metaphor to describe how people will do more after sin. But in this case, the person on the one on the other end is God, who every single day we say in our prayer, thank you for forgiving us 3 times every day.
Are you saying he betrayed God?
We're talking about teshuva for sins, right? I was just using that as an example to demonstrate how when people betray others, they try, if they really mean it, to do more to prove their loyalty. So likewise, in our relationship with God, we're pretty confident He's forgiving. So we end up doing more to prove that we really mean it. Okay? It's a challenge for most people to learn to forgive. Imagine if someone came to you 3 times a day, say sorry for what I did this morning, and then in the afternoon, sorry for doing it again this afternoon, and then the evening, that's what we're doing essentially, 3 times every day.
Your father taught us.
Sorry?
Your father taught us that somebody has to say, if they say sorry 3 times, we're required to.
You are, yes. We say it 3 times every day to God, right? Anyway, the Alter Rebbe writes how the Jewish law is that you can only make a bracha on a certainty, right? So if you're not sure if you're fulfilling a commandment, for whatever reason, you would do the commandment without making a blessing. That's the halacha. If a person's in doubt as to whether or not they're fulfilling the commandment, they do it without a bracha. Now, which means that we only make a bracha if it's a certainty. Now we make a blessing, 3 times a day in prayer. Blessed are you, Lord our God, who's abundance in forgiveness. If we're making a blessing, it means we're certain. Which means we're certain that 3 times a day, He's saying, I forgive you. Oh, you did it an hour ago? Forgive you again. Forgive you again. Forgive you again. It's pretty incredible.
But when you say someone is an abundance of something, it doesn't preclude in everything. It's just an abundance. It's not an absolute.
Rab l'sleach means like a multiple of forgiveness. It means He's constantly dealing out forgiveness.
Okay.
Right? Also, any attribute of God is infinite. So if He's forgiving, then it's infinite forgiveness. Right? Okay. So that's one level, the Maharsha, which interprets this statement which says that sin becomes merit to mean that one who does teshuva out of love, in their excitement, in their enthusiasm, in their vigor, wants to add and do more for God, and therefore gets more merit in that way, because they end up doing more mitzvahs. Okay. The Kappas Tamarim writes as follows. Another commentary. He says like this. The Gemara is going to tell us later on the second page. The Kappas Tamarim is on the top there. The Gemara is going to tell us later, or the Talmud later states, that how do you know when a person did real teshuva? What's the litmus test to know if a person truly meant it when they said, I'm not going to do that sin again? So the Talmud says the litmus test is, if a person goes back to that same location, under the same circumstance, with the same temptation, and this time says no. Now you know that the person really meant it when they said, I'm not going to do it again. This is what the litmus test. So says the Kappas Tamarim like this. If that's the meaning of teshuva, then take 2 people. One person who never sinned and is put in that scenario, and one person who enjoyed the sin in the past and is put in the same scenario again. Who's going to have a harder time refraining? The tzaddik doesn't know what he's missing out on. Walks by a non-kosher restaurant and keeps on walking because he never ate non-kosher. It doesn't make a difference to him. But a person who once tasted it and then walks down the restaurant and gets a smell, the decision to not walk in is much, much greater. It takes much, much more effort. So says the Kappas Tamarim, there is where the Baal Teshuva gets more merit. Because in the same act of refraining from sin, there's much more effort on his part than the person who never sinned. He quotes another Gemara which talks about, actually a verse, which says, Mayim genuvim yumtaku, which means stolen waters are sweeter. What the verse means to say is that when you know you're breaking the rule, there's a thrill. There's a thrill in know you're breaking the rule. So, sorry? If you don't get caught. That's the thrill, that you might get caught, right? So, sorry?
My father says in French, c'est pas interdit de tricher, c'est interdit de se faire attraper. It's not forbidden to cheat, it's forbidden to get caught.
I don't know about that. I don't know about that. But anyway, so this statement that the stolen waters are sweeter, meaning to say that there's a thrill of breaking the rules. So someone who's enjoyed that thrill may want to do it again. But a goody-goody who never doesn't know the thrill of breaking the rules, okay, so it's not a big deal not to break the rules. There's no temptation. And therefore, says the Kappas Tamarim, there is the merit that the Baal Teshuvah gets, and that it takes more effort to refrain from sinning. So so far we had two levels of interpretation. One is the Marsha, which says that in the Baal Teshuvah's enthusiasm, they end up doing more mitzvahs and therefore more merit. Interpretation number two is that refraining from sin requires more effort for the one who once upon a time sinned, and therefore there's more merit there. Clear? The problem with these two interpretations, yeah?
Well, it just seems to me it's like the tzaddik and the Baal Teshuva.
Transform it and turn it into.
Right.
So let's get into all that. We'll get into all that soon. But I think to your point, I think that's a good way of putting it. I was gonna. Oh, that the Alter writes in Tanya. I think in chapter 30, where one should look at somebody else who maybe succumbed to a sin and say, what are the circumstances that led that person to that sin? Quoting the Mishnah, which says that you shouldn't judge somebody else unless you're in their shoes. So what are the circumstances that require the person to get to that sin? And what is the type of effort that person would need to go through to refrain from that sin that you are judging him on? Now turn the question around to you. Have you put that much effort into anything you're doing for God? I'll kind of put it like that. So you're right, it's different. They're in different places and they have different pathways, if you will. But yeah. So far we had two interpretations. One, that this merit that the Baal Teshuva gets is because they're enthusiastic and do more mitzvahs. And number two is that the Baal Teshuva requires more effort to refrain from sin, and therefore there's more merit. The problem with these two interpretations is not in their inherent nature of what he's describing, but rather in interpreting the actual text of the Talmud. The precise language of the Talmud is that the sin becomes a merit. Now, in these two interpretations, the sin don't become merits. The merit is some other extra stuff you're going to do because you're excited about reconnecting to Hashem, or the fact that you're refraining from doing sin. But the sin you did in the past tense doesn't become merit. So even though these interpretations are very nice in terms of the experience that a Baal Teshuva might go through, it doesn't help us understand the text, which says that the sin itself becomes a merit. We clear on the question here?
But you said that they put in extra effort.
That's right, but the sin you did in the past doesn't become a merit. The sin remains a sin. We're letting go of it, but we're going to give you more merit because of your effort, right?
But the sin itself inspired the greater effort. And without, like,
Okay, so let's get to that. We're going to go one at a time.
It's because they were able to put in so much more energy, meaning they took the negative.
Well, we'll get to that, but we're going one at a time. We're building up. We're going one at a time. We're going to get to that. But just for now, in terms of what the previous commentator stated, in other words, the Kappas Tamarim didn't mention what you said. He didn't say any of that. What he said was that it's harder for you to refrain from sin in the future, which is true, but that falls short to explain how the sin itself becomes merit. Now, what you're saying is true, and we will get to that. But as far as these interpretations go, this is where they fall short. Are we clear? Mm-hmm. Yes? Okay. Now we have the Maram Shif, which says, it's on page 3 if you want to look at the Hebrew, which says, every sin, every action, every sin, and every mitzvah creates an angel. An angel. The angel either becomes a prosecutor,
Defender.
or a defender. So if it's a mitzvah, then the angel becomes a defender. If it's in a sin, the angel becomes a prosecutor. Now, every angel has a body and a soul, just like human beings do, and just like animals do. They have the flesh that make them up, and then the life that's invested in them, body and soul. Angels also have that in their ethereal, spiritual realm, but they still have body and soul nonetheless. So what creates the body of the angel, either the defender or the prosecutor, is the action you take. Either mitzvah or aveda, mitzvah or sin. The soul of that angel is created by the intention you put into that action. And together makes a body and soul an angel. So if the intention in the mitzvah is my love for Hashem, then the angel is not just a technical defender, but an enthusiastic intender, because it has this live soul that came from my love of Hashem, and so on. So says the Maram Shif like this: when a person does teshuvah, the act doesn't go away, which means the body of the angel that they created doesn't go away, because the act didn't go away. What changed is my intention. Okay, so now the soul of that angel changes, because my intention changed. But to what degree did my intention change? If my intention for teshuvah was out of fear of God, then what changed in my intention? Maybe I would sin again, I'm not sure. And therefore, that body, that angel, created by the act of sin, when asked, what's your position on this fellow, says, I don't know, I'm not sure. So that angel stands back. It becomes an unintentional sin. Whereas, if a person does teshuvah out of love, so now my intention has switched from I'm violating Hashem to I want to get closer to Hashem. So if you ask this body, this angel, what do you say about this fellow? So this angel's going to say, what do you mean? This guy did teshuvah. He loves Hashem. Because the person's intention changed, and therefore the soul of that angel changed. Therefore, what the angel's going to say is different. So the angel still exists because the act still exists. But because my intention changed, what the angel says changes. Changes from, he acted out, this is a bad guy, or what do you mean? This guy does teshuvah, he loves Hashem. Becoming from a prosecutor into a defender. So this is how he explains how the sins become merits. And that the angels go from prosecuting to defending, in that my intention, which created this speaker, the soul of this angel, changed from betrayal of Hashem to love of Hashem. Clear? A little bit ethereal, but still clear nonetheless. Okay, so I found that interesting. Thought I would share that. Level number 4, somewhat Kabbalistic. This is page 4. You can see it's the quote. It's level 4 or 5. I'm not losing track. This comes from the Tzemach Tzedek, who is the third Chabad Rebbe. In his very young age, he wrote a book called Derech Mitzvah, which is a book that explains a number of mitzvahs based on their Kabbalistic / Hasidic interpretation. And he says as follows. This is something that you can find throughout Chassidus in general. I don't want to get too deep into the Kabbalah, but just to explain briefly. There are 2 levels of klipa, of that which is not godly. You may have heard this concept before. There's 2 levels of that which is not godly, otherwise known as klipa. The word klipa in Hebrew literally means a shell. Why are we calling that which is not godly a shell? Because everything has divine spark in it, otherwise it doesn't exist. Things only exist because God invests of his energy to create it. So what's the difference between something which is holy and something which is not holy, if they all have divine spark to keep it going? The difference is the shell. Is this item concealing the truth that God is in it, and to what degree is it concealing that truth? Like a shell that conceals that which is inside. Clear? Okay. So now there are different levels, 2 levels specifically, generally speaking, within the realm of klipa of that which is not godly. One is the majority of this world. It's known in Hebrew as klipas noga, which means a klippa with a ray. That's what noga means, a ray. Quoting the verse in Yecheskel's prophecy, his vision of the chariot. Sorry?
What's ray?
A ray of light. Like a ray of light, which means it has hope. It has hope. It has a redeemable quality. So, put it very simply, this glass is amoral. Doesn't have a say in anything. It's not kosher, and it's not kosher. It depends what I do with it. So it has the capacity for elevation. It has the capacity, at the moment, at least when it was created, when it was made, it didn't express godliness. So it was klipa. It was a shell that concealed godliness. But if I take it, I make a bracha, and I'm using now this glass to help me study Torah. So now it's been taken out of the realm of that which conceals godliness to be an expression of godliness, and thus elevated from klipa to kedusha. That's the majority of this world. The majority of the world is created from that level of klipa. A lower level of klipa is that which is irredeemable. And that basically is non-kosher. We can think of it in food as the easiest way to think about it. Non-kosher food, but it's any non-kosher action. Meaning any action the Torah says not to do, the reason why you can't do it, explains Kabbalah, and this is what Tzemach Tzedek writes here. The reason why you cannot do that act is because there's a divine spark in there, but that divine spark is so buried so deeply that it's irredeemable. And therefore don't go and try to eat it and elevate it. It can't be elevated. The divine energy is trapped inside of that item, inside of that klippa. Which explains, he alludes to it here, but the Alter explains this in chapter 8 of Tanya, where the term asr and mutter come from. The word asr, which translates as forbidden, and the word mutter, which translates as permissible. Those words also translate as, asr translates as tied up, and mutter translates as released. So forbidden, tied up, permissible, released. Meaning to say, that which is forbidden is bound and tied up. Don't try to elevate it. That which is permissible is released and available for your elevation.
What about foods that are not permissible now, but they say will be permissible? Things that aren't permissible now, but will be permissible at times of Mashiach?
Good question. And this exactly explains that. Because when Mashiach comes and there is no concealment on godliness, why would anything be forbidden? It's forbidden only because the godliness is so buried and hidden that you cannot elevate it. But if it's not buried and hidden, why should it be forbidden?
Well, because some things still will be, won't they? No?
Depends on what, but that's the general rule. Anyway, so it says out that someone said like this. Now there's another principle in Kabbalah like this, which is that whatever is lowest, wherever's highest falls lowest. So whatever is perceived, and whatever is, presents itself in our world as a lower level of reality actually has a higher divine source. That's the rule in Kabbalah. Which means, right, the metaphor is a wall that falls down, and the higher the stone is on the wall, the farther it falls from the base of the wall. If the wall were to collapse, right, the highest point in the wall falls farthest from the base. So it says it's if that's the case, now let's think about this. The divine spark that's in non-kosher food has a higher divine source than the spark of divine energy in the kosher food. Because non-kosher food is lower. If it's lower, it must have a higher source. It's just so high and therefore came so low that you can't elevate it until Mashiach comes. Except for the Baal Teshuvah. A Baal Teshuvah who consumed not kosher food, so consumed a divine energy that's very, very deep and very high. It's so high that it came down to a very low space that's even not kosher, and then does Teshuvah. So this Baal Teshuvah elevated a spark that is essentially not a spark that initially was giving energy to a non-kosher food and therefore must be of a very high source. And theirs is greater merit. Because he brings along with him a higher level of godliness that was invested in the non-kosher food that the person engaged in, or non-kosher activity the person engaged in. Whereas the tzaddik, who never sinned, doesn't have access to that level of divinity which is invested in non-kosher food and behavior. Clear? It's a Kabbalistic interpretation. It's quite something. Yeah? Okay. Finally, the Hasidic interpretation. And this gets to something you guys were all pointing to essentially, which means it's great, you guys all learn this. And this comes from Tanya chapter 7. Where the Alter Rebbe writes as follows. He begins by saying, the last page, page 5, he begins by saying that which I said earlier, how forbidden and bound are the same root word, asr, and that which is forbidden is bound and can't be elevated, and mutter translates as both released and permissible, because foods that are permissible are released for you to elevate. And then he says as follows, that the only time this divine spark that's invested in that which is not kosher will be elevated is when Mashiach comes. And he quotes the verses. And then I want to read the Hebrew, and I'll translate literally because the Hebrew itself is very powerful. The words the Alter Rebbe uses are very powerful. So if you're looking at the text on page 5, this is Tanya chapter 7, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines on the top of the page, the second to last word, oi, or. Another option for how non-kosher food items can be elevated. So the Tzemach Tzedek just stated the fact. The fact is that when a person does teshuvah, he elevates these sparks that are invested in this low space. But how does that happen? So explains the Alter Rebbe like this. Oi, or, ad, to the point, sheyasa tshuva gedola, a person does such a great teshuvah, kol kach, so much so, shezedonis, that his intentional sins, nasalak ezochis, become like merits, mamish, literally. How does this happen? Shehi, this happens, tshuva ma'ava. It comes from tshuva out of love, as the Gemara stated. This is from the first text that we quoted, which is that when Reish Lakish stated that when a person does teshuvah out of love, their intentional sins become merits. This is when a person does teshuvah out of love. But what kind of teshuvah out of love, says the Alter Rebbe? This teshuvah is me'umka deliba, from the depth of one's heart. Ba'ava rabba, with intense love, v'chashika, and desire, the nefesh shekeka, and a pining soul, the dofka ba yisparech, to cleave onto him, may be blessed, capital H, talking about God. V'tzoma nafshe la Hashem, and his soul is thirsty for God, ke'eretz ayefa, like a desolate land, dried out, v'tzia, dried out and desolate land. So this is 2.5 lines describing the intensity of his desire to want to get close to Hashem, which, in parentheses, this is built on that which the Alter Rebbe said earlier, that the definition of love in Tanya is the desire to want to get close. That's the way, the feeling of emotion of love, as the Alter Rebbe describes it. There are different levels, but the basic definition is the desire to want to get close. So this teshuvah out of love, he describes this great, intense love where a person has this great desire, like a dried out, desolate land, wanting to get close to Hashem. Now, why does he have this intense love? So says the Alter Rebbe, Ki ad heina, because until this point, until this teshuvah, he was in a dried out and desolate land. Where is that? This is the opposite side, meaning that which is ungodly. He was in an ungodly place. And he was distant from the light of God's countenance. Betachlis completely. And therefore, because of the intense distance that the person felt from Hashem, his soul is thirsty with greater intensity. With more intensity than the thirst of the souls of the tzaddik. If the definition of love is the desire to get close, then the tzaddik who never left home doesn't feel that intensity of love. Whereas the Baal Teshuvah, precisely because of their distance, is why they feel that intense love. A very practical way of thinking about it is, kids love their parents when they're in camp more than when they're at home. That simply. You're far away from home, now all of a sudden you feel like you want to get home again. When you're at home, So the tzaddik who never left home doesn't feel that intense desire to want to get close because they're never far. But the Baal Teshuvah who was in distance, therefore does feel this great, extreme, intense desire to get close. And the more intensely the person feels their distance of sin, the more intensely a person will feel the love to get close. And therefore, Kamay Maram Zal, and this is like the stages of our stages, maybe of blessed memory, which stated, B'makim Shebal Tshuva Oindim, in the place of the Baal Tshuva stands, Chulu, etc., the tzaddik can't get there, because the tzaddik can never feel the intensity of desire to get close like the Baal Tshuva can, because he never left. Baal Tshuva Ma'avar Abazu, and if Teshuvah of this great intense love, this Teshuvah, Amru, our sages said, and this goes back to our Gemara, our statement, that is, intentional sins become like merits. Why? Hayil, considering the fact, by it's through the sin that he came to this great intense love. Why does he have this great intense love and desire to get close? Because of the sin. And therefore the sin is the merit. The sin itself is the merit for the teshuvah. Because the distance is what generated the desire to get close. And in fact, in later chapters, the Alter Rebbe takes a person through an exercise where a person feels like they can't get motivated. They can't get motivated to want to feel something closer to Hashem. They're not feeling motivated. So the Alter Rebbe goes through 2 chapters, taking a person through an exercise to consider the distance that a person has created through their own sin, or distance just by virtue of the fact that you're a human being and therefore inevitably infinitely distant from Hashem, And therefore that will engender within the person the intense desire to want to get close. Which gets to, I mentioned way at the beginning that the Alter Rebbe has an essay on Teshuvah, the 12 chapters. The first 4 chapters are technical, like halachic definition, and the last 5 through 12 are the Kabbalistic. And if you can summarize 5 through 12, it's basically a very detailed description of how every sin literally cuts one off from Hashem. And the point of that is to motivate the person to the point that why do I want to, the halachic decision where a person says I no longer want to sin. That's the technical definition of teshuvah. Person makes a decision, I no longer want to sin. But what should motivate that Kabbalistically? What should motivate that is the distance that sin created. And the more I appreciate and feel this distance that sin created, the more I will feel the intense desire to want to go close, thus transforming the very past into the fuel for my future. This is the almost the highest level I can say of understanding this Gemara, beyond just the person feels like they betrayed and therefore wants to technically do more mitzvahs, and beyond the fact that it's harder to refrain from sin, and what was the next level? Beyond the fact that the angel goes from one side of the court to the other side of the court, and even beyond this Kabbalistic idea that a person elevates these sparks of divine energy that was invested so low, it all comes from this essential point, which is that when a person appreciates and feels the distance from Hashem, that will become the fuel which will motivate the person to want to get much closer and a deeper and deeper and deeper love for Hashem. So here we have layers and layers of understanding one text. This gives you an appreciation of looking at one text in the Talmud, and you got one layer after another layer, all in one statement to the Talmud. And I'm sure there are many, many more interpretations that I don't know about on this Talmud. And maybe all have an level that is indeed inspired and motivated by these ideas.